My name is George DeRosa, past commander of the American Legion, Post 162, Hillsdale, Woodcliff Lake, and Old Tappan. And this evening, we'll be taping Freddie Winkler, a member of the Post. Good evening, Fred. First, Fred, where were you born and where did you grow up?
I was born in West New York, May 10th, 1926, and I've lived in Hillsdale all my life. My mother had the baby in West New York because my father had an embroidery business that he turned over to his brother and bought a store in Hillsdale in the Marcella building, a grocery store. And my mother was pregnant at that time, but her doctor was in West New York, and she wound up staying with my father's brother until the baby was born, and about 2 weeks later she came home with the baby. And we lived on Harrington Street for approximately seven years, and we moved to Large Avenue, and that's where I resided until my father passed away in 1941.
And you went to Park Ridge High School?
Yes, but unfortunately, what happened was I graduated in '39 in Hillsdale and was a freshman in 1939 in Park Ridge when my father became very ill. My mother had been ill. I left school and I started working to make ends meet at taking care of my mother and father, but unfortunately my father had lost the store in '39, and shortly after that, when my father had the heart attack, my father was in the process of losing the house. Anyway, I left high school for 2 years. I worked at Travolta's tire shop at nights. I worked in the little A&P. I worked in Colucci's garage over in Washington Township, anything to make any money to help my mother. Unfortunately, things were looking better, but my father did pass away in 41. And things turned out to where we wound up living. The Maras brought us in. They had an empty apartment up there in between the Marcellas and the Travoltas, and they took us in we had nothing. And anyway, that's where I stayed. I finished high school, and then I enlisted in the Navy in, I think about March in 1944.
So you did graduate Park Ridge High School?
I did graduate Park Ridge High School.
And what branch of the service did you go in?
Navy Air Corps.
And why the Navy?
Well, it's a very interesting story. During the 30s, they used to have different programs in the Pascack Theater in Westwood. They had a series about a submarine that couldn't get up from the bottom of the ocean, and they started working they had like a big tube that they could bring down and put it on top of the submarine where one of the hatches were, and they would attach that to get the men out of the submarine. And that program went on and on because different things happened in between, and it was a matter of night and day, or day and life, or whatever you want to call it, before they could get those men out. And the wind-up was they eventually did rescue all those men, and that stuck with me. That I said someday I want to be a submarine man. I had no idea of a war or anything, but I said I would love to be in a submarine, and that's what happened when I joined. When I went to boot camp and I was interviewed.
Where was boot camp, Freddie?
Sampson, New York. Anyway, when I was interviewed, they ask you, a lot of things and what you'd like to do. So I told them that I'd like to become a submarine man, get into submarine service. So anyway, time went on, and I was notified that I wasn't accepted. And I didn't know at that time until the day came when my part of my boot camp broke up, where they were sending it different people to different parts of country to where they were going to be stationed. And it's so wound up that I wound up becoming a Navy airman and wound up in Pensacola, Florida. I was very disappointed. And I finally found out one day, I don't know how it all came about, why I wasn't accepted in submarine duty. And the unfortunate part, why I was told, was because my mother wasn't a citizen. And as I said before, I feel it was a rebuff as to me wanting to be in a submarine and then having the opportunity to maybe sink a submarine, because I became a Navy airman. As I say, wound up in Pensacola, Florida. I took my training in Bronson, and from there on, we used to do duty in the Gulf of Mexico, along the Atlantic, and out in the Atlantic, and we had a sub base for refueling on the Banana River in Florida. That's where we would go to come in to be refueled at different times. But my main duty was the Atlantic coast and the Gulf of Mexico. I had 3 experiences of spotting a telescope out there, and what we do at that time is we notify base, and they have what they call a PBM. The PBM is a large version of the PBY.
You served on the PBY?
On the PBY.
The Catalina?
Yes, the Catalina. That's what they call them. I was a mechanic under the tower, in the middle of the plane, where the wings come out, right in the middle. There's a part that goes up with all the instruments that control the engines, all the different instruments, just about the same as they have up front with the cockpit where the pilots are. And the main thing is to watch all the different intervals of the pressures and everything else on there. When the occurrence comes, we notify base right away, and they send out the PBMs. The PBMs had the depth charges on them,
Right.
2 depth charges. And a lot of times, by the time they got there, I can't honestly say and remember if they ever did locate any to drop the depth charges. To my knowledge, they didn't.
The job of going out on a patrol was to spot periscopes. And then what happened? Then you'd call in for the PBMs?
That's right. We would stay in the area. We would stay in the area as long as we could to keep the direction of where they were going. And at intervals, we didn't see the periscopes anymore.
Right.
In other words, they were probably looking for ships, regular ships.
Right.
That's probably where my conversation comes in. The periscopes went up. Whenever we spotted a periscope, they were looking the area over to see if there were any ships in the area.
Right.
And they don't keep that periscope up all the time because they keep on moving. They're making all different. The German submarines, when the war was really hot and heavy, they were sinking the ships right outside the Gulf of Mexico, and they were based. The German submarine base was in Argentina. That's where they were being refueled.
Right.
And I think I mentioned in there that the Graf Spee, that was their headquarters. They were knocking off the British ships for a long time before they could get enough ships together to come down to take care of that battleship. It wasn't actually a battleship, it was a heavy cruiser.
Right.
But they finally wound up scuttling the Graf Spee right outside of their port there. But that's where the Germans were being fueled. They had their fueling base in Argentina, taking care of the submarines and the Graf Spee. The Graf Spee was raising hell for quite a long time, sinking British ships, merchant ships, in other words, being transported back and forth.
Yeah. You also mentioned that probably a lot of Americans don't know that actually there were German submarines in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, that's
during
true.
the war?
And they were doing a big job on us, and it wasn't a well publicized area because at that time in the beginning of the war we didn't have enough ships to combat the German submarines. In other words, all the effort was put into the Atlantic with destroyers trying to get the cargo ships across to Europe. And the Germans were they were knocking us silly with the submarines. They were knocking ships off left and right.
Right.
Until the American, manufacturing got into a point where they had enough ships that they could start patrolling the Atlantic. Towards the end, there was no more action. In other words, as the war was starting to go down, there was very, very little action. There was no action in the Gulf anymore. But in the beginning, it was. They were knocking off the merchant ships coming out of the Mississippi. It was bad. It was bad.
Yeah. Your PBM or PBY had a crew of 4 men?
No, PBYs had 3.
3.
The PBMs, they had the extra man on there.
And
Yeah, my job, I was one of the crew. It was the captain and the co-captain,
okay.
and I was the mechanic.
Did you have many breakdowns on those PBYs with the?
Oh yeah, we were out on patrol, and one of the PBYs went down, and we went and took the crew out until they got help out there. I don't know how long it took, but it took a long time before they got a crew out there to bring the plane in. They send out 2 boats, regular Navy boats,
Right.
to tow the ship in. I don't know how long it took them.
You also mentioned that there was no armament on your PBYs.
We had no armament.
You'd come back home, being Pensacola, Florida, after these patrols, and recreation time.
Saturday night was boxing night, and the one thing that struck me, they had this fellow, he'd be 6'4", weighed about 250 pounds. They had this little guy about 5'5", and at the 3rd round, this guy jumps off his feet and hits the guy, and the guy goes down like a regular knockout. And I still think to this day it may have been a put up. It probably was, but it was a great show. But there was always something different. Boxing night.
Yeah.
They had all different angles of different fighting going on. It was very interesting.
And you also mentioned that you played softball. You were on a softball team?
Yes, I was on a softball team, and I did pretty good. I was a 400 batter. The nicest part about the recreation part, whatever time we had, I had the opportunity of meeting Ted Williams. In fact, I don't know what happened to the paper, but I had one part of one of the write-ups that day. Ted was probably out fishing because that's all he'd like to do was fish. But we had Glenn Drysworth and Ted Williams, both players for the Boston Red Sox. And I became to know Ted Williams quite well, not only during the war, but after the war too.
Yes.
At different games at Yankee Stadium.
What medals did you earn?
American Theater and Victory Medal.
And the highest rank that you held?
2nd class aviation machinist mate.
Petty officer, 2nd class.
Yes.
You mentioned about one of the saddest moments on base when you heard about the president dying.
News flash came over, and it was a sad moment. Everybody was asked to say a prayer, and I remember the meeting was called off. We went back to our barracks.
Well, not only was Franklin Roosevelt the president, he was your commander-in-chief.
Right.
You mentioned about an officer or a non-commissioned officer.
Yes.
Who took a close liking to you.
Yes. When I got to Pensacola, we were shipped out. There was 5 fields altogether. They took care of 5 different airplanes in the Navy, all training bases, and my base was the PBM base, and right off the bat, it wasn't a day or two. And I don't exactly remember where I was at the time, but this officer came up to me and we got into a conversation. And he took to me like a father. And his first thing, I remember him asking me where I came from, so on and so forth. And asked me about my parents, and I told them that I had lost my dad. Well, from that time on, no matter where I was or wherever I went, every once in a while we would meet one another, and he always came over and talked to me, and he said to me, he says, if there's anything I can do for you, he says, don't hesitate, don't hesitate. And he also flew. It was in one of the PBYs at one time with a student. In other words, another pilot that was learning the operation, and I happened to be the mechanic on that plane. And after we docked the plane, I don't know if I told you, it takes 4 people. The plane comes in to the beach, and 4 men are out there, and they swing the plane around and bring it up to a ramp, and then they bring the wheels out, and the wheels that get reattached to the plane, and then they have a tractor that pulls the plane up and parks it. But there were, I don't know, it was endless times when I met him over the years I was in service there, and he reminded me so much of my father, because he always told me, do what's right. He says, do what's right. He said, and stay out of trouble. We called him the old salt. And always remember, you never know when it can happen, but always remember your buddy. And if you can help anybody, never forget what you can do for others, he said, because it may be your own life, he said, because you never know. But he was a real Navy man. He lived right to the line. There was no fooling around. I'll be honest with you. At that time, I was so enthused with the Navy. Not only that, I liked to fly, because once in a while I got the opportunity to go up in the cockpit and sitting with the wheels on, you know.
Yeah.
And but anyway.
Did you get flight pay for that?
Got flight pay.
Yes.
We got extra money for flight for. Every month in our regular pay, we had I forgot how much it was, but
yeah.
I don't know whether it was $25 or $45 extra that we got in our flight in our regular pay monthly.
Freddie, you mentioned that the advantage of these PBYs and PBMs is that they could land on the water and take off on the water. You use the expression they could land in a swamp.
That's right.
And be effective.
They were one of the greatest savers in the Philippines. They were taking people out of areas where there's practically no water.
Right.
The PBM, I don't know whether the PBM was ever used for that, George. All I know for a fact, because we had literature on that in the library down in Pensacola, had pictures of it, where they would come in swampland and bring out people.
I mean, to this day, probably every day you help somebody in some way, Fred.
Well, George, it's been my life. It started right in my father's store. I used to deliver groceries with my bicycle. I used to deliver groceries with my wagon, and I'd go to the different customers in the area, and there was always an opportunity sometimes of doing something for a person, right? And it became another way of doing something for somebody, and in many cases you would get a quarter or a half a dollar or doing something.
Yeah.
And it was a big teacher to me, and the biggest teacher to me was living in the Mara family. My mother became very ill, and 3 firemen, Bill Pitt, Marty Schaefer, and Rudy Arpel, Mrs. Mara, downstairs every Friday night in the Mara kitchen with Mr. Mara and Mrs. Mara, and maybe even Gay Mara. And after that evening, they used to play cards. And there was Mrs. Mara, Christina Mara, her sister Sable. She was the hair practitioner. She did the women's hair there. And there was my mother and Charlotte Travolta. They used to play cards. Well, this particular Friday night, my mother didn't come down for supper, And the entrance to upstairs was on a driveway, and when you walked in, you could either walk into the kitchen or take the stairway upstairs. And Saturday, my mother doesn't show up. She used to go down to Teg's Candy Store, which eventually moved across the street. He built that building where they sell stamps. But anyway, she used to go for cigarettes and the paper. She didn't show up Saturday either. So Sunday morning, Mrs. Mara says something's not right. Mrs. Mara went upstairs when they found my mother. Well, what happened during that time, my mother was in the hospital. I came home on emergency leave. When my mother came home, the Hillsdale Fire Department, Ladies Auxiliary, took care of my mother around the clock for 1 year. And my mother said when I came out of service, and not only were they great, but other people were great, because a lot of people in that time were customers of my father and mother, and they knew one another. They helped one another, right?
Yeah.
And my mother said, never forget what people did for us, and that's been my life.
Freddie, how did you hear about the surrender of Germany?
I was out in the I was in the air. It came over the radio. I had the earphones on. Yeah, that's when I picked it up. The only thing I can't remember what happened when Japan's. I still don't remember what we were doing or where I was at that time.
You said you came down from the cockpit in the plane.
Yeah.
And you guys were jumping up and down.
Yeah.
And then when you landed, you went to some place that night?
We went to the Paradise Hotel. We had a great time.
You also mentioned some unusual duties about they calling upon you to watch 50 German
yes,
POWs.
that was very
prisoners of war.
interesting. That was very interesting.